let you guys get situated for just a second. Years ago today, on July 29th, 1873, in Liberty Hall, Lawrence, right here where we are, the lecturer of the National Grange, Thomas A. Thompson of Minnesota, gave a public speech for those who had arrived for the organizational Kansas State Grange session. Thomas Thompson was the uncle of John R. Thompson, who was one of our founders. In the speech, he spoke of the necessity of the Grange. Its, quote, desire to bring producers and consumers nearer together, unquote, the great importance of education of farmers, and a rumbling sound that would soon, quote, resound in the halls of Congress, unquote. The event was called to order by state lecturer, John A. Kramer, he's not related to me, who had been acting more like a deputy in those early days, traveling the state to organize granges, and even starting a newspaper called The Spirit of Kansas in Lawrence. I suspect that it was Kramer who secured Liberty Hall for the meeting. But before you think this was work, but without discord, know that less than 1 month before the organizing session, other Grangers were calling him a, quote, fraternal fraud in lengthy editorials to other papers. The meeting held on this soil 150 years ago today wasn't easy, but all Grangers knew it was necessary. Liberty Hall, as it existed in 1873, is not the same building we're in today. That building burned, and in 1911 was rebuilt, and that is this building that we're in today. Family historians have a saying, you live as long as you are remembered. Today, as we celebrate 150 years of the Kansas State Grange, we also remember our Kansas State Grange founders, those that were at this place 150 years ago to be a part of the organizational session, as well as others gone before us. I'd like to think that they're smiling down on us today from the great Grange above. Welcome to our 150th celebration. I got just a few announcements. If you are unable to do stairs very well, they did open up restrooms in the concession area. You'll just go up the ramp like you're going outside and take a right. So in the concession area. Also, we have displays all around the room here. So I hope you'll take time to look at them during lunch, after lunch. And if you would like a picture of or with the cake, you better do that pretty quick. So we're going to turn it over to Jamie for our blessing, and right after that, chow down.
You may remain seated with an attitude of prayer. Our most gracious and heavenly Father, today we gather with thanksgiving to celebrate 150 years of the Kansas State Grange. As we celebrate this milestone, we ask you to strengthen our ties that bind in our work and our fellowship. Beginning tomorrow, may we continue our work on the foundation before us for the next 150 years. We thank you for the many blessings bestowed upon us. We ask for a blessing upon this food. May it nourish our bodies just as your words nourish our soul. Together we say, Amen. And I guess we'll start at the far end and work our way through the food line.
I think before I start, I think when the invite went out, I have no doubt that they were not anticipating that we would actually show up, but here we are. And we're thrilled to be here. We're thrilled to be here to join you as you celebrate 150 years, as you look back on the achievements and what those folks that handed you the keys were able to do, and now what you've done. But even more exciting, I think, is looking forward at what that next group, what these young ladies here are going to get to do with the keys when you hand them to them. So that's the neat part of these sorts of events, is not only the honor to look back, but the excitement of looking forward. So with this, I will get to read the proclamation from the governor. It says, to the people of Kansas, whereas the Kansas State Grange marks its 150th anniversary, July 30th, 2023. And whereas the Kansas State Grange was founded in 1873 by Kansas's farmers to serve the needs of Kansas farmers, to be a vital support network and organization, to assist and advocate for farmers' education and education of their families, and to ensure a strong voice for members and their communities. And whereas the Kansas State Grange was an early champion of women's suffrage and equality, first requiring 4 of its 16 offices be seated by women, and vigorously advocating for women's right to vote originally in Kansas City elections and soon after everywhere. And whereas since its inception, the Kansas State Grange has long been a strong proponent of education through the funding of local schools, supplying of students' textbooks, and scholarships for the education of young Kansans. And whereas the Kansas State Grange continues its mission of aid and support for its communities, its members, Kansas farmers, and vital parts of the Kansas economy and people. And whereas the state of Kansas recognizes the 150 years of service by the Kansas State Grange. Now, therefore, I, Laura Kelly, Governor of the state of Kansas, do hereby proclaim July 30, 2023 as the 150th anniversary of the Kansas State Grange in the state of Kansas, and I urge all citizens to join in this observation.
Thank you, Chris. On behalf of the Kansas State Grange, thank you for presenting that, and thank the governor for making the proclamation. Thank you.
Service to our community has been a part of the Grange's purpose from its founding in the early days. Granges would help their members in numbers. Just a moment, please. Okay, I'm going to start over. Service to our community has been a part of the Grange's purpose from its founding in the early days. Granges would help their members and neighbors in times of illness or need by putting in their crops or harvesting them, caring for livestock, taking meals to families, Kansas, a committee on women's work was appointed, and in 1889, their report speaks partly as to how the committee was organized, and that each state also was to have a committee, partly dedicated to charity work. So while the National Grange and Kansas didn't create an official community service program until 1948, 75 years ago this year actually, it's clear that early on community service was a part of the Grange's programs. The Grange work women's clubs in the early days were a big part of this type of service work. The ladies would work together to make bandages for hospitals, preserve food by canning for care homes, and make quilts for needy persons. They would also do beautification projects for their Grange Hall and fill needs specific to their community, from making meals for a family to providing household items and clothing for families after a fire or a storm. During the war years, they worked on projects for the Red Cross. Working together in this way fosters a sense of community and bolsters the mental well-being of those doing the work. Today, the National Grange partners with Rural Minds, a group that works to improve the mental well-being of rural Americans. In 1916, the name Women's Work was changed to Home Economics on the national level. Kansas added a Home Economics Committee at that time, later merging the two just before the advent of the separate Community Service Department. However, the Home Economics Committee, later Women's Activities Committee, and later Family Activities, and now the Lectures Department, still have several projects in conjunction with the Community Service Department. The Community Service Program 1948 to present. With the new Community Service Program came a national competition. Some from Morning Grange may know this story, but it was not included in the Centennial History book. A practical application of community service was shown in 1955 when Morning Grange was once again in the top 10 in the nation out of 4,212 entries. The judges, a team from all over the nation, were at Morning Grange in late October 1955 when the fire alarm was sounded. Several of the Grange members were also volunteers for the Spring Hill Fire Department and left the judging to see to the fire, which damaged the home of Grange members, the Pecks. Mrs. Peck was at the Grange Hall helping prepare the lunch for the crowd gathered for the judging. Mr. E.J. Peck had been out plowing, his farm duties taking precedence that day, and he came home in the late morning to smoke pouring out from the house. He's quoted as saying, "All I could think of was the Grange, so I jumped into my truck and went racing up to the hall for help." And that was quoted in the Kansas City Star back in October of 1955. Morning Grange was vying for a $10,000 first prize. For comparison, a new car in 1955 cost about $2,500. They won second place in the nation and won $5,000. This is the highest placement any of our Kansas community Granges has won. Did the quick action to go put out the fire sway the judges? We'll never know. The projects Morning Grange were judged on that day included the completion of a roadside park on the then new U.S. Highway 50 just south of Olathe. Also the donation of 1,000 canned quarts of fruits and vegetables to hospitals and a boys' home, quilts and layettes to be donated to needy groups, and a resuscitator purchased for the Spring Hill Fire Department, the money being raised by the Grange. In all, Mrs. Agnes Stewart had to explain 26 projects to those judges. The expenses related, the money raised, the number of workers, and the results of the project. And a news reporter for the Kansas City Times reported that the judging was compared to a Senate hearing. Morning second place win was during the 16 years that Sears and Roebuck sponsored the contest and the prizes. 3 Kansas Granges placed in the top 10 in the nation in those years. Inland Grange was a finalist in 1950 after members revitalized their Grange through service work when needs came up in their community. Their projects included a dairy heifer program in cooperation with the 4-H Club, rebuilding their town telephone system, organizing church services, and having a wolf hunt. In 1953 and 1955, Morning Grange made the top 10, winning second in 1955 as just outlined. Gardner Grange made the top 10 in 1956, sponsoring Teen Town in Gardner, addressing 8,000 letters for a polio campaign as well as sponsoring a polio march, and gathering pledges of $3,000 for a new fire truck for Gardner. Gardner in 2021 again placed in the top Granges in the nation, having founded the Gardner Farmers Market, and it continues to this day. To get a broad view of the state program winners over the last 75 years, we tallied up the first and second place winners since 1948. 4 Granges names stood out. They are Morning Grange and Gardner Grange, both in Johnson County, Carbondale Grange of Osage County, and Ash Valley Grange of Pawnee County. I cannot begin to tell you all the projects of these and all of the Granges have completed since the program began. But in looking at it as a whole, it's overwhelming what our organization has done for Kansans. Carbondale Grange secured a medical clinic and staff for their town. Cadmus and Mainville Granges hosted dances, craft fairs, and other activities for the communities. Pleasant View raised the money for and installed the street signs for the new town of Ozaki when it was displaced by Perry Lake. Rangers have built buildings, started clothing and food pantries, created cookbooks to raise money for numerous causes, purchased and donated hundreds of dictionaries to elementary 3rd graders, presented numerous... Thank you. And it's not just the adults that have made a difference. Our junior Granges have done some amazing projects through the years, with the 1990s being a decade of excellence. Otter Creek Junior Grange placed in the top 4 8 times nationally in the 1990s, including first place for community service in the nation in 1995 and 1999. They also won the Our Earth Needs You contest nationally in 1993 and 1997. Pleasant View Junior Grange placed second nationally in community service in 1996. And under her state level leadership, Sherry Namashek was awarded National Junior Director of the Year in 1998. Sherry, can you stand, please? As we celebrate 75 years this year of our community service program and 150 years of service to Kansas, I'd like to thank all of you for your volunteerism. I close with a quote from Anne Frank. How wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world. Well done, good and faithful Rangers.
Thanks, Randy.
Well, speaking of cookbooks, you know how we like to eat. A banquet or a covered dish dinner. So we'll have a little fun here. Here's our cookbook quiz. How many cookbooks has the State Grange published? Not local Granges, but the Kansas State Grange.
5.
I hear 5. 4.
8.
What did Lance say? 6.
8.
8. Well, Lance wins. It's 6. So can you name them and state why they were created? Do you know the first year? Okay. Well, the first year was 1939. If you find it, let us know, because we can't find it. Do you? All right. We'll look forward to that at State Grange. This cookbook commemorated the 50th anniversary of the Women's Work Committee. So that's 1939. Okay, the next one was 1964-65. Home Economics Committee was a fundraiser for the 1965 National Session. The next one was 1972-73, and this was to commemorate the 1973 Kansas State Grange Centennial.
Randy says I need to trot across the stage tonight.
We'll just call her Vanna, okay? Okay, the fourth one is 1988-89, and this was maybe a fundraiser for the 1990 session. Pat West, the Women's Activity Chair, and her committee were Mary Martin, Naomi Kincaid, Mary Huck, Beverly Gist, Jean Peterson. Is that also Jean Johnson, Pat? Jean Peterson? Oh, from Lynn County. Okay, so it is Jean Peterson, Patty Pearson, and Pat Douglas. It was titled Country Covered from the Kansas State Grange. Now we got more help. And then the fifth one is the 1994 Family Activities Cookbook by Mary Huck and Jean Johnson were co-chairs. And then the sixth one is the 1998, a cookbook to support the Grange Center by Jean Steffi, titled Best of the Best from Kansas Kitchens. And it truly is a thick cookbook. So which one of these was reprinted? Any guesses? It's the 1993, the blue one. It was the original one in 1965 and was reprinted in 1993. So does anyone own all 6 cookbooks? Debbie? Anybody own all 5 cookbooks? Lois? Melanie? Okay. Does anyone own all 4 cookbooks? Well, there's a few more hands. Good. So there's your cookbook quiz. Thank you for my helpers.
We're going to go back in time a little bit now. In 1872, after years of monopolistic behavior by railroads, extreme interest rates, high prices for farm equipment, and even small-town merchants having different prices for town customers and farmers, people decided it was time for a change. Commodity prices were low. Farms were failing. The economic pressure was too much. Farmers needed an organization that would stand for them. The Patrons of Husbandry, the Grange, which had been founded just 5 years before, was the answer for thousands in Kansas and across America. After loosely organizing in December of 1872, the Kansas State Grange set their first official session for July 1873 in Lawrence, assuming there were 40 organized Granges at the time. There were 9 when they set the date for the first session, and only 4 of the Granges had representation at that December 1872 meeting. They elected a skeleton slate of officers and went out to organize more Granges. Like I mentioned earlier, the evening prior to the official opening, which was July 29th, 1873, many had gathered here at Liberty Hall to hear the National Lectures address. The next day, Wednesday, July 30th, 1873, was the first official and organizational meeting of the Kansas State Grange. I'm going to be using the traditional office names of Master and Overseer, since that's what they used then, instead of President and Vice President like we use now. National Grange Master D.W. Adams of Iowa and National Lecturer Thomas Thompson of Minnesota were present during the proceedings. State Grange Master Frederick Dumbald of Neosho County presided over portions of the meeting, as well as the National Master presiding over portions of the meeting. President Dumbald gave his address outlining the events that led up to the organizational session. The State Secretary, George Spurgeon, reported that there were 322 regular subordinate granges and an additional 87 organized subordinate granges, totaling 409. Bourbon County had the most with 43, followed by Crawford at 34, Franklin County 32, Douglas County 31, and Leavenworth County also 31. Owing to the fact that his home had been destroyed by a tornado 2 months prior, and with it, the records of the Grange, he was unable to report a total number of members. President Dumbald's home and farm buildings were also destroyed in the same tornado, and each man had lost a family member and had others injured. What obstacles they overcame during the founding of our organization. 2 months, and then they had State Grange. There was a disagreement over voting privileges, and with no bylaws to guide them, the discussion became heated. But in the end, an agreement was reached. Resolutions were also presented and referred to committees on the first day of session. The second day, which would have been Thursday, July 31st, 1873, was devoted to the work of committees and delegates. Several resolutions were passed establishing the first policy statements of our organization. Topics included equitable railroad freight and passenger rates, taxation, horse racing, and support of the 27th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. All fourth-degree members could attend and observe the proceedings as the policy was set. So I'm thinking that the delegates would have been down where you guys are, and there would have been all these people up in the top watching. In the evening, several toured what they called then the State University, which we now know as the University of Kansas. It's kind of confusing. The third and final day of the session, which was Friday, August 1st, 1873, the Kansas State Grange Constitution and bylaws were adopted. Also, they had election of officers. Don't know why they did it in that order. Those nominated were allowed 2 minutes each to speak, and after 2 ballots, the field was reduced to 2 candidates. Frederick Dumbald, who was the temporary master, and Titus Bowling. Dr. Bowling won the next ballot by 1 vote. 155 for Dr. Bowling, 154 for Mr. Dumbald, and they had 2 write-ins. So I imagine that caused a lot of whispers. So he lost, but Mr. Dumbald was then later elected to the executive committee. I'm not going to read the whole slate of officers here, but back where Bob is, there is that list on that display there. Those nominated and elected had something in common besides being in an agricultural occupation. Many had served in the Kansas legislature or were county commissioners. The first Pomona, Amanda Rippey from Doniphan County, was prominent in temperance and suffrage activities and later turned down a nomination for governor. While Frederick Dumbald wasn't chosen to lead the organization, he ended up being vital on the executive committee as he secured cooperative buying contracts for grangers with implement dealers and insurance companies. Dr. Bowling resigned as master in December, noting that his medical practice, his farm operation, and the Grange were more than he could handle. He remained a Grange member and later served in the Kansas State Senate. Overseer Montgomery Hudson became enough to be a true leader for our Grange. He was the first to attend a national session, and he worked hard to manage an organization that experienced balloon growth as cooperative stores opened and tested the scope of a nonpartisan organization as these same farmers, as a voting bloc, became powerful enough to elect members to the Kansas legislature as members of the Independent Reform. They later were called the Greenback Party, and then the Populist Party. That should maybe spark some of your history from school. The first session held on this spot 150 years ago was an example of what the Grange does, bringing people together to work towards a common cause. Let's keep that spirit of advocating for rural America as we go forward. And I just gotta say one more thing. There was a list I had out a couple years ago. A newspaper reporter snuck in somehow and tried to copy the roll of delegates as best as he could, and they printed it in the newspaper. And I had asked everybody to look at it to see if there was somebody they recognized as being a relative or something like that. And nobody said anything to me about it. So I'm going to pick on your state treasurer just a little bit because one of his relatives is on that list. So, anyway, if you look, you'll see J.F. Willits on the list of first delegates. That's John F. Willits. He lived at McLeod, Kansas, Jefferson County. He's Jamie's cousin by marriage. He ran for governor on that independent reform ticket. He was soundly beaten, but for years and years, like in the late 1800s, they had, that third party, the Populists. And some of them did get elected to the legislature. We never had a governor from that party, but he was the candidate for governor. I think it was in 1890. So there's your family connection for the day. Anyway, so thank you for that, and we're going to have Lois come up here and give you another quiz.
Very bright up here. All right, national sessions. Does anybody know how many times we've had National Grange in Kansas? I heard 2 and 3. 5. 10. No. Yeah, that was kind of the little scary question. Okay. 1888, it was held in Topeka. 1922 in Wichita. 1965 in Topeka. 1990 in Wichita, and 2021 in Wichita. And then the bonus question was, where else have we been a host? And that was the 1945 one in Kansas City, Missouri. But Kansas and Missouri hosted that one. And then 2011 in Tulsa, and 2016 in Lincoln, Nebraska. And back to the 1965 one in Topeka, that was the 100th centennial, I believe. It's when they put out that little centennial book that's kind of cream colored. I'm sure you've all seen that. If you look like 2/3 through the book, there's a little picture of some junior Grangers that put on a program at National Grange, and my picture's in there. So, if you want to look. I think I even did a tap dance with my sister for the program. But anyway. Okay. Now, name the first time the 6th degree was performed in Kansas in a subordinate Grange Hall. Anybody got any guesses on that one? Roger, maybe. Okay, it was November 6th, 1945, at Barrington Grange Hall near Topeka. The hall was overflowing with people wanting to take the 5th and 6th degree prior to the National Convention in Kansas City, Missouri. The 5th degree was performed by the Jefferson County degree team to a class of 89, and the 6th degree was performed by the state officers to a class of 212. So that was apparently a very crowded building. And then how many times was the 6th degree held in 1965 prior to and including the national session in Topeka? Anybody got any guesses on that one? 6? It was actually 8 times. And my mom was part of this degree team. It was the state officers at that time. And she talked about, I remember her being gone for quite a bit. They went out on kind of a little tour of Grange Halls and put on the 6th degree, and they would be gone for a week. The 6th degree was conferred 8 times in 1965 in Finney County, Kingman County, Yates Center, Cadmus Grange, which is in Lynn County, Bonner Springs, Carbondale, Parsons, and Topeka. And we're getting ready to put on all 5 degrees at Cadmus Grange in a couple weeks, August or a month, I guess, August 26th. And we haven't had degree work in Kansas for quite a while, I don't think, so excited about that. And who was the state president when Kansas hosted the National Convention in 1990 in Wichita? Anybody remember that? I bet Patty knows. Remember? Anybody? It was Paul Martin. I remember lots and lots of work getting ready for that national session in 1990, because that's when the states did it on our own, and we didn't have a region to use all the funds from the region. It was just our own state. So we did a lot of work for that one. Okay, that's all on that quiz. Thank you, and thank you all for coming.
Good afternoon. What I've got is a little bit of summary of what possibly you've already heard today. I've got a few other items in there that wasn't mentioned. I know Randy talked a lot about the women's activities and the women's works in the Grange, so some of that's here, but some of it's already been there. But I would like to say that I did get a text on the way down here today from the past president of Iowa State Grange, G. Edelin, and he wanted to thank everybody and congratulate him on 150 years, so I wanted to pass that along. Also want to thank Dwayne and Chris for taking time out of their busy schedule as retirees to make it to Kansas. I saw them a week ago in Michigan for the Grange Revival, and they took a long way home to Washington State through Kansas, so thanks for coming down, and glad you could be here today. So welcome to the sesquicentennial celebration of the Kansas State Grange. For those guests in attendance which might not be familiar with the organization, the Grange is what we refer to as our community, county, state, and national chapters. It is a common name used by our fraternal organization, the Order of Patrons of Husbandry, which was founded nationally in Washington, D.C. in 1867. 5 years later, the movement had reached the plains, and on December 4th, 1872, there were 9 Granges. They met to elect temporary officers to work towards organizing enough Granges to become a state Grange. Their goal was to have 40 by July of 1873. That goal was met tenfold when 150 years ago tomorrow, July 30th, 1873, delegates from 400 Granges in Kansas met for the very first official session of the Kansas State Grange on this very spot, Liberty Hall. The building was dedicated just 3 years early as Liberty Hall, as a nod to Abraham Lincoln's once having called Lawrence the cradle of liberty. Those of you, mainly Chris and Dwayne, that aren't familiar, Quantrill heard of Quantrill's Raiders. Well, Lawrence was the town that they sacked when they made that raid at the beginning of part of the Civil War. So I think Liberty Hall actually survived that one, but it was burned later. And by December of 1873, just 1 year from meeting of those 9 Granges, Kansas had grown to nearly 1,400 Granges throughout the state. By Kansas now having officially a state Grange, it allowed Emmy Hudson, the Kansas State Grange Master, to attend the 7th National Grange Convention in February of 1874 in St. Louis as the first Kansas delegate. This was the first national session held outside of the Washington, D.C. area. Before that, the first 6 sessions were primarily the founders and working out logistics of how they were going to get their organization off the ground with a few other early state presidents. Emmy Hudson was also served on a committee at that time that wrote the Declaration of Purposes. That's a document which is still used today and one of the first things presented to new Grange members. As you can imagine, Liberty Hall has changed in the last 150 years. The previous building in which the first session of the Kansas State Grange held burned in 1911, and this building was erected in its place. The Grange, too, has changed in that amount of time, but the original idea of being nonpartisan and non-sectarian and helping to educate and elevate the American farmer has not. As early as 1876, cooperative stores were established throughout the state to give members economic assistance by buying commodities in bulk in train car loads. Cooperative stores continued as part of the Grange until 1978, when the last one closed at Cadmus. In the 1870s and 1880s, members organized a cooperative bank and insurance company, originally named the Patrons Fire and Tornado Association, which was later changed to Patrons Insurance Company. It offered members affordable insurance for home and farm, and in 1953 began offering automobile insurance to Grange members. During this time, the Grange began endorsing the Kansas Farmer, a newspaper which ran a column for Grange members for many years. In 1888, just 15 years after the State Grange was organized, Kansas hosted its first National Grange session in Topeka. Kansas has since hosted or co-hosted the national session 5 times in the state. Wichita in 22, Kansas City 45, in which they co-hosted with Missouri. Topeka 65, Wichita 90, and again in Wichita in 2021 as part of the Great Plains region. By the 1890s, rural free delivery was a hot topic, and the Grange lobbied heavily for legislation to create mail delivery to each and every home, both in the cities and the rural areas. The legislation passed in 1893, and by 1897, Kansas had its first RFD route. Continuing with the Grange's dedication to rural America and the farm families living there, the organization was a strong advocate for passing of the Smith-Lever Act in 1914, which established cooperative extension services, which later led to 4-H and home economic programs available through the land-grant universities. Seeing a need for educational programs for children of members, the juvenile, later called Junior Grange, was formed, where children aged 5 to 14 could learn valuable skills in leadership, animal care, and home economics. And in 1916, the first Junior Grange was formed in Sumner County. A state Grange lecturer in Michigan began clover clubs, which would evolve into 4-H in the 1920s. Responding to a need for more leadership training for members, the National Grange created the Youth Department in 1934, and Kansas held its first youth camp in 1948 in Sedan. Other camps were held in Elmdale, Dodge City, and Labette, and by 1967, Junior Grange began to camp at Lone Star Lake. 3 years later, the Kansas State Grange had built a headquarters and camp in Meriden, Kansas, at Perry Lake, and on land that was donated in 1962 by Grangers Claude and Ina Bry. 8 years of fundraising culminated in the dedication of the Kansas State Grange headquarters and Bry Youth Camp on May 31st, 1970. The headquarters and camp continued in use until 2004. Senator Arthur Capper, a longtime Grange member and co-sponsor of the Capper-Volstead Act of 1921 and 22, knew the plight of the farmers and used his position to legislate for ideals that the Grange had long stood for. The Capper-Volstead Act provided limited exemption for farmers who market their products on a cooperative basis. For his dedication to the American farmer, Capper was awarded the first Kansas State Grange Distinguished Service to Agriculture Award in 1951. Other notable Kansas receiving this award have been Senator Frank Carlson in 1965, Governor John Carlin in 85. At that time, Kansas Secretary of Agriculture Sam Brownback in 1988, WIBW newscaster Kelly Lenz in 95, Senator Nancy Landon Cassabaum in 1996, Dr. David J. Mugler, Associate Dean of Kansas State University's College of Agriculture in 97, and WDAF farm newscasters Mark Oppold and Mike Railsback in 2000 and 2001, respectively, and Senator Pat Roberts in 2008. Organizations receiving the award have been the Kansas State Board of Agriculture in 1993 and the National Agricultural Hall of Fame in Bonner Springs, Kansas in 2010. As Jane mentioned earlier, Grangers love to cook and love to eat. Potluck dinners have a common occurrence at Grange meetings, and Grangers have produced several cookbooks for fundraising for many projects. In '39, celebrating the Women of Work in Kansas, 65 favorite recipes was published before hosting the National Grange Topeka and reprinted again in '93. In '72, the Grange Centennial Cookbook to help funding for the Kansas Grange Centennial, which included a centennial pageant and a centennial parade right in front of this building down Massachusetts Street here in Lawrence. A video of that parade has been on display. In 2021, Kansas State Grange held its 150th session here in Lawrence. For those who are trying to do the math on the 150th session 2 years ago and the 150th anniversary today, there were a few years that they had 2 sessions. One was during the flu pandemic in the 1920s, and they had to meet again 3 weeks later. And another was when they decided to change the meeting date from earlier in the year to the fall. So instead of waiting almost 2 years, they had 2 that 1 year. As I said at the beginning, the Grange has changed over the past 150 years. With today's technology, we actually had our annual conference via Zoom on both state and national levels during the COVID pandemic, so we didn't have to wait and meet again 3 weeks later. So thank you and enjoy the rest of the celebration.
To close our program, I'd like to recognize the committee that made today possible. Julie Duran, Jamie Clinton, Lois Barber, Alice Ficken, Randy Farmer, Marianne Hara, and Penny Book. Also to Roger Bostwick, Chris Hamp, Sherry Dingus, Melanie Bostwick, Jamie Duran, Mike Farmer, Lance Hara, Susan Kramer, and Andy Barber for their help with presentations and preparations. Mike and Randy Farmer made the Grange ornaments at each of your place settings. Gardner Grange donated the stickers. We hope you learned something new and have a greater appreciation for the work done by and for Grangers. Feel free to stay and visit for a while and take in the displays. I'd also like to invite you to attend our 152nd annual convention to be held September 29th through October 1st in Gardner at the Hampton Inn Conference Center. We look forward to seeing you there. Thanks and have a safe trip home.